Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Thursday, December 12th, 2024. This is The Excerpt. Today, what's next for the FBI as Christopher Wray announces his resignation, plus how post-grad football lures players with a second shot at glory. And we take a look at new recommendations for cervical cancer self-testing. FBI Director Christopher Wray is set to resign amid criticism from President-elect Donald Trump. I caught up with USA Today Justice Department correspondent Bart Jansen for the latest. Hello, Bart.
Hello.
So, Bart, let's just start with some of the basics. Tell us a little bit about Christopher Wray and his tenure as FBI director.
Well, Wray, he had been FBI director for 7 years out of what was anticipated to be a 10-year term. Congress created the 10-year terms to try to remove the post from politicization. He was also a Yale-trained lawyer who served in the early part of his career as a prosecutor in Georgia, and he rose through the ranks in the Justice Department before working 17 years for a private law firm and then becoming the FBI director in 2017.
So this decision now to resign, Bart, let's talk through this a little bit. And just as for him and Donald Trump, can you help us understand the tensions there and how Trump has previously criticized him?
Trump appointed Wray in 2017 to succeed Jim Comey, who Trump fired because he didn't consider him loyal enough. So Wray came in. He is a fellow Republican, and he was Trump's pick, but the FBI contributed to the investigation of Russian interference with the 2016 election, which angered Trump, who called the investigation a hoax and a witch hunt. After he left office, the FBI searched his home in Mar-a-Lago in Florida because of concerns that Trump had brought thousands of White House documents with him after leaving the White House in 2021. Well, that search in the summer of 2022 yielded hundreds of classified documents, and Trump was indicted on charges that he unlawfully retained those national defense records and that he conspired to hide them. A federal judge recently dismissed those charges by ruling that the prosecutor was appointed illegitimately. But again, that whole case and the investigation left Trump very upset. And so in his statement on social media, he called the announcement of the resignation a great day for America, said that it would end the weaponization of the Justice Department, and that under Wray, the FBI had illegally raided his home without cause and worked diligently to impeach him. It wasn't an illegal search. It was a typical search that had been approved ahead of time by a judge. So there had been Trump criticism of the FBI for years before this resignation. And then after Trump won the White House again in November, he made it clear he was going to replace Wray. And in fact, he named Wray's intended successor.
Bart, what has the response been like there in Washington, be it from lawmakers or others? What are you hearing?
Well, Attorney General Merrick Garland, who oversees at the Justice Department, the FBI, he commended Wray for his principled leadership and said that he had served honorably and with integrity. Natalie Barra, the president of the FBI Agents Association, said that Wray led the agency through challenging times with a steady focus on keeping the country safe. But Republican senators were highly critical of him, echoing many of the criticisms of Trump. Senator Chuck Grassley, a Republican of Iowa, who is the incoming head of the Judiciary Committee that does oversee the FBI and will hold the confirmation hearing for Wray's successor, had sent Wray a letter on Monday saying that his failures in leadership of the FBI had damaged his confidence and that Grassley said that it was time for him to leave. Senator Ted Cruz, a Republican of Texas, said Wray was either going to have to resign or be fired, so that he was glad that he made that decision. Senator Josh Hawley, a Missouri Republican, said Wray's departure made the confirmation of his successor even more urgent, but no less significant. Stepping in his defense, Senator Mark Warner, a Virginia Democrat who heads the Intelligence Committee for now, said Wray prioritized the FBI's mission over politics.
Well, in terms of who will succeed him, Bart, what do we know about Trump's pick to replace him, Kash Patel, and what functional differences might he bring to the FBI?
Patel's a former intelligence official who's been a very loyal supporter of Trump and has talked about a major overhaul at the FBI. He talked about closing the FBI headquarters, turning it into a museum so that the officials who work there are spread out across the country to investigate crimes rather than become a political entity here in the nation's capital. He had advised the director of national intelligence and the defense secretary during Trump's first term, but he's a polarizing choice. House Speaker Mike Johnson, a Republican of Louisiana, said that it's important to bring Patel in and overhaul the agency. But as Patel has threatened to investigate Trump's political enemies and shutting down the headquarters, as I mentioned, that has raised questions about how much the agency might change under his leadership.
All right, great breakdown for us. Bart Jansen covers the Justice Department for USA Today. Bart, I always appreciate you stopping by. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
House Republicans passed a nearly $900 billion defense policy bill yesterday that includes a provision to ban certain types of medical care for transgender children of military service members. The provision, added to the National Defense Authorization Act, prohibits TRICARE, the healthcare program for active duty service members and their families, from covering medical interventions for gender dysphoria treatments that, according to the provision, could result in sterilization to children under 18. TRICARE has about 9.5 million beneficiaries, according to the military health system. It's likely that the provision will face tough hurdles in the currently Democrat-controlled Senate, and is the latest proposal by Republicans to take aim at transgender issues. Last month, Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson announced a policy banning transgender people from using restrooms in parts of the Capitol that correspond with their gender. It came after Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace introduced a resolution with a similar effort targeting Democrat Sarah McBride of Delaware, who was elected as the first openly transgender woman in Congress last month. We've also seen Supreme Court justices debate earlier this month on whether states can prevent transgender adolescents from using puberty blockers and hormone therapy. Conservative justices repeatedly suggested the issue should be left up to state legislatures. Young men nationally play post-grad football after high school, aiming for another shot to play for a college. But many say the teams fail to keep their promises. I spoke with USA Today investigative reporter Chris Quintana about he and investigative reporter Kenny Jacoby's findings. Chris, thank you so much for carving out some time on this.
Thank you so much for having me.
What are these postgraduate football teams, and what role do they really fill for some of these athletes coming out of high school?
They are essentially private football teams, and they're geared towards young people who didn't get the collegiate football offer that they were after. And so that could be a D1 school, a D2 school, or just any sort of school where they were looking to maybe play under a scholarship or to help subsidize their college costs. What's important to remember is that these programs seem like colleges. Sometimes they may even have names like prep or collegiates in them, but they are not colleges. They are private football teams.
Yeah, so what are some of the issues here? I mean, what did your investigation really uncover?
So these programs are built to help young men get better at football and maybe get a collegiate offer that they hadn't gotten before. As part of that, some of these programs say that they'll provide food or they'll provide housing. We have one program in particular, it's called Mississippi Prep, where a bunch of players told us that they were expecting some consistent meals and that just didn't happen. And we also talked with a lot of players across a bunch of different programs who were told that their housing would be taken care of, but then they find out that they're going to be living with like 5 other guys in a room or, just kind of crammed into these spaces. The other big thing that we saw a lot of is these teams are playing in an unregulated space. So they're not necessarily required to respond to concussions or heat injuries or medical episodes in the same way that, say, a team under the NCAA would or a high school team would, like under state laws, right? And so we also found that for many of these programs, they don't have consistent athletic trainers to help with their players. And, that's like a real challenge, especially in a contact sport. We've talked with a bunch of people who got injured, some who got injured so badly that they had to stop playing football altogether.
I think some folks might be wondering, like, why would this be worth it? But there really is this idea of the football dream, right? And kind of achieving this and some of the things that are required to do so. Can you talk through the power of the football dream a little bit, Chris, and how it can bring folks to do kind of all sorts of things to try and achieve it?
Yeah, something that emerged as a consistent theme across all these interviews we did with these young men. They've been playing football for pretty much the entirety of their life. They're starting when they're young, 5, 6, and it's just sort of become part of who they are. And so when they're reaching the end of their high school career and they're looking forward to a future that doesn't include football, that becomes hard. And I think part of it too is for a lot of these guys, the hope is that football will lead to like a pretty substantial college scholarship, right? And for some, the cost of attending college just on their own without any sort of aid that they might get from a scholarship is intimidating.
And Chris, have any kids who have gone through these programs made it to get, let's say, the college offers that they set out to get? Do any kids find their experience valuable in other ways? I mean, what do we hear kind of on the other end of this conversation? And what do the team owners say about all this?
There are certainly some people who found success in these programs. They tend to be few and far between. In our reporting, we found just a handful of folks that actually were able to get to a D1 program from going through like a post-grad program. And they often come with caveats. We've talked with some folks who say, yeah, I did get to this great school that I was excited about, but I don't feel like my post-grad team really was the entity that helped me get there. Some teams that are better than others, and the space is not a monolith, but often what we found is that the young people go through these programs and then they end up at a small D3 college or a junior college, which, a lot of folks told us they might have been able to walk onto or just be recruited to straight out of high school without this independent prep step along the way. And as far as the post-grad owners go themselves, what we found often is a willingness to criticize other post-grad teams and to say that there are a lot of bad actors in the field, but that their program is the one that is doing well. It's not uncommon to see criticisms of their program chalked up to disgruntled customers or people who just didn't get what they want.
Yeah, and we should note Derek Crudup Jr., Mississippi Prep's owner and a former quarterback for the University of Miami, disputed much of what at least 7 players said about his program. Chris, the question I kept coming back to in reading this piece was about oversight. Is anyone keeping an eye on these programs, and really what's the potential solution going forward?
We found that law enforcement doesn't do a whole lot in this space. I don't know if that's because these teams can disappear so quickly or rebrand, but we did find an example in South Carolina where local authorities charged a man with 2 counts of defrauding a hotel and 3 counts of obtaining a signature under false pretenses, and he was actually found guilty of those charges in relation to a post-grad program that he was running. Those are rare. In some cases, we did find another example where one player started a class action lawsuit against his team. And so they tried to go that route. And we talked with the lawyer attached to that case, and he said it ultimately died out once it reached a bankruptcy proceedings. And so that team continues to exist in some way, shape, or form today. So these aren't high schools, these aren't colleges. It's hard to figure out who would be in charge of these spaces.
Chris Quintana is an investigative reporter with USA Today, and just great work as always on this, Chris. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
New guidelines from a national health task force say that women aged 30 and older can now use a swab to collect their own samples to screen for cervical cancer. Draft recommendations announced this week by the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force would mean women between 30 and 65 years old can forgo Pap smear procedures to detect HPV, the most common sexually transmitted infection that also causes nearly all cervical cancer cases. The draft recommendations also apply to people who were assigned female at birth, including transgender men and non-binary people. For Pap smears, health professionals collect samples from someone's cervix during a pelvic exam to look for cancerous or precancerous cells, according to the Mayo Clinic. The new self-collection, done at the doctor's office every 5 years, is intended to increase screening among women, particularly those who don't get screened regularly. In a news release, the task force said the new recommendation aims to avoid unnecessary follow-up tests and procedures. A foundational principle of the U.S. Constitution is the idea that no one is above the law. And yet, the power of the presidential pardon essentially guarantees that, in fact, a select few are actually not held accountable for crimes they have been found guilty of. President Joe Biden's sweeping pardon of his son Hunter is a case in point. What can the historical use of this power tell us about how we should judge this political inflection point? Listen later today, beginning at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, when my colleague Dana Taylor is joined by USA Today Justice Department correspondent Bart Jansen, he heard earlier today, to dig into this complex and politically fraught topic. You can find the episode right here on this feed. And thanks for listening to The Excerpt. You can get the podcast wherever you get your pods, and if you're on a smart speaker, just ask for The Excerpt. I'm Taylor Wilson, and I'll be back tomorrow with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.